Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's session of Faces and Traces of Violence. I have the honor to introduce Professor Alan Feldman from NYU. I know there's no need for any further introduction and that we are all familiar with his work. But I'd like to point out some of the most important highlights of his career. Alan Feldman is a professor of visual culture in the Department of Media, Culture and Communication at New York University. He's the author of Archives of the Insensible, of War, Photopolitics and Dead Memory, of Formations of Violence, the Narrative of the Body and Political Terror in Northern Ireland, and of numerous essays on the politics of the senses, the political anthropology of the body, and the visual culture of war. He has conducted ethnographic fieldwork in Northern Ireland, South Africa, and the shooting galleries of the South Bronx. Today, Professor Alan Feldman is going to give the lecture, War Under Erasure, Disappearing Extra-Judicial Death. And I would like to personally thank you, Professor Feldman, for coming here and for sharing your insights and your time with us. I'm sure your lecture is going to be very inspiring for us.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Francisco Ferrándiz, Dr. Lydia Mateo for arranging this talk and for the, on short notice, for the incredible hospitality they've showing me. And the more I learn about this series of lectures, the more fascinating. Of course, I knew nothing about this series, and yet almost every lecture is central to my own theoretical and investigative research concerns. In my recent book, Archives of the Insensible, I have been working with the degree to which the war on terror, but also anticipatory other conflicts like those in Northern Ireland, also in South Africa, where I work in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how the organization, the epistemological and visual organization, in war, I do not think we can separate the visual from the epistemological organizational war, is very much structured around invisibility. And that's a hard concept to grasp because we think of war as very into material destruction, into making a sensorial impact on its targets, and yet a good bit of the organization of the war on terror has been a war against the witnessing of war. A war against the witnessing of war. Particularly witnessing that could contribute to the de-justification of war, in which war begins to disappear. A war comes under erasure. So if you think of the doctrine of collateral damage, this is where war begins to come under erasure, because collateral damage is not seen as central or axiomatic to the pursuit of war. It is a state of exception, it is an accident, it's unintentional, whether it's a drone crowd killing where innocent people who are not identified as terrorists are killed, or the whole concept of the drone signature strike where they do not know whether or not the target is a terrorist group or not, but they target them anyhow for extra-judicial capital punishment. And the reason why war has to render itself invisible is that it has to seek indemnification. It has to perform what Jacques Derrida called auto-immunization. How can war immunize itself from accountability, being held accountable to the laws of war, to international justice, and even to the American people in the context of the war on terror, or the British or other countries. For example, if you consider the attack on Paris in 2015, when French Prime Minister Hollande, in the aftermath of that attack, promised retribution and the bombing of Syria, right? In response to the killing of the Bataclan and other random deaths in Paris on that night. Unfortunately, Hollande admitted the fact that he had already been bombing Syria, and that the civilian deaths in Paris that night were the collateral damage of his civilian bombing, and I could figure this out, and I'm not very smart, and I'm sure Hollande and his advisors knew this quite well, that if they attacked, they bombarded Syria ostensibly to dismantle ISIS, but of course they were killing non-combatant Syrian civilians, that this would justify legitimate retaliation against French civilians on French soil. And yet he disconnected his prior bombing of Syria from the attacks in Bataclan, and then used the attacks, we call this disaster accumulation, extracting surplus value from that attack to renew his assault in Syria, but also to tighten up on civil liberties and other, securitizing measures in France in the aftermath of those attacks. Another example of the kind of self-immunization of violence is, and I should read you the quote itself. This is from Bibi Netanyahu in the aftermath of the assault on Gaza by the Israeli missile strikes in 2014. I'll give you a quote from Netanyahu. He gave to CNN. "All civilian casualties are unintended by us, the Israelis. They're actually intended by Hamas. They want to pile up as many civilian dead as they can because somebody," they said, it's gruesome, they use telegenically dead Palestinians for their cause. They want the dead, the more, the better, end quote. So here, it is not the Israeli missiles that are killing Palestinians, it's Hamas who is deliberately positioning Palestinians to be killed by Israeli missiles. This is what Frank Wilderson, black theorist in America, calls that in racist cultures, there are certain bodies that do not magnetize bullets, and there are other bodies that do magnetize bullets. So in Netanyahu's phantasmagoria of war, each carefully launched Israeli missile is subject to a mishap by its refunctioning by Hamas, imputedly committed to the mechanical mass production of televisual Palestinian dead. The Israeli first-person shooter, I'm borrowing that term from video games, who's morally inoculated by the Holocaust, right? Because Israel is a victim of genocide, so Israel is incapable of reproducing genocide on others. So the Israeli war apparatus is morally inoculated by the Holocaust and is given an a priori and racialized incapacity for atrocity. Therefore, when it bombs and shoots missiles at Gaza, it practices a ballistics of innocence. A ballistics of innocence. The Israeli missile assault was described by one Israeli government spokesman as restricted by hesitancy and care. We don't really want to shoot the Palestinians, but we have to. And that we are in search of, this is their language, sustainable quiet. Under this regime of care and quiet, civilian casualties in Gaza are imputedly and plotted by Hamas. Israel's launched ordinance becomes the accidentalized prosthetic of the Palestinian will to telegenic death. Palestinians want to die on TV, and that's why they put their bodies in the way of Israeli missiles. This is Netanyahu's logic. The true violence of Gaza is casted lead by Netanyahu as the enclosure of the agent and patient, the actor and the recipient of force exclusively within the body politic. In other words, the Palestinians are committing political suicide and physical suicide in the face of Israeli, as a way of protesting Israeli incursions. So this is a kind of invisibilization of war as a form of self-indemnification and auto-immunization of the war apparatus, rendering war invisible and occluding the capacity to witness war, which tends to have a problem for human rights discourse, because human rights discourse is all about showing and shaming. It's an enlightenment discourse that wants to exhibit war crimes in order to shame the perpetrator of war crimes, to get them to stop, to desist. But what happens when there's nothing to show anymore because war has been rendered invisible? So this is what I want to talk about today, and I want to give you a case history. I want to talk about denegated images, images that do not sustain a stable identity, but oscillate between the visible and the invisible, and purposely so that you cannot position them in a particular way. And I know that this concept will be very problematic for those of you who are involved in forensic anthropology or other forensic exhumations here on the Civil War dead and missing and disappeared. Because forensics is all about positive images, images stabilizing history through the remains of the body, through what I would call the habeas corpus. Not the habeas corpus, because that requires a living body, but the habeas corpus. And the kind of solidity of the corpse. Papa was telling me about how DNA now is the vehicle for authenticating identity. So the need to stabilize identity is all about remaining in the visible. Now I'm going to give you a case history where in the War on Terror, where the soldiers and the command structure who are fully aware of these new forensic technologies and discourses and their high status in humanitarian, international law, humanitarian practice, fully aware of the capacity of forensic reenactment and recreation of the crime scenes of war. And what they're doing now is falsifying the forensics of their acts of violence. Okay? There are no forensics, their forensics can be falsified and they can be counterfeited. So, let's start. This is an image of Gul Madin. Gul Madin is an Afghani poppy cultivator, or was. And in sometime in May in 2011, an American military unit, the Stryker Brigade, the 5th Stryker Brigade, or Kill Team, encountered Gul Madin in his poppy field cultivating poppies, right? And this kill team, which was operating in Kandahar province between 2010 and 2011 in Afghanistan, were ultimately found guilty by military courts of murdering 3 Afghan civilians, originally targeted as Taliban. So they had a practice of killing Afghan civilians and reconstructing them as Taliban guerrillas. It was likely that this unit killed many more people than that through extra-judicial killings. And they were also known for post-mortem mutilations of the bodies by cutting off the fingers of their victims. And there's a photograph of one of these soldiers equipped with medical trauma shields. So one such series of photographs taken at the village of the Muhammad Calais shows a soldier snapping a biometric photograph of the retina of an Afghan male corpse, the remains of Gul Madin, supposedly because he was Taliban and they're creating an archive, a biometric archive of Taliban guerrillas. Leading up to the scene, the soldiers who encountered Madin threw a grenade at him. He was unarmed. And the grenade was quickly followed by a weapons discharge from the 2 other members of the team that killed Madin. Then, in their report, the soldiers claimed that the grenade itself had been thrown at them by Madin. And the grenade that was thrown at them was a Russian grenade. And what these soldiers have been doing as part of their forensic falsification is they have been collecting weapons from the Afghani police that the Afghani police had confiscated from other Taliban soldiers and captives, right? And they were practicing what's called drop weapons. Drop weapons is when I go around and maybe say, he's Taliban, and I shoot him, and then I leave a Taliban weapon next to his body, right? That's part of the forensic falsification. And what the soldiers did after they threw the grenade was they cleaned up all the debris that would, the kind of powder or whatever, that would have anyhow indicated that the grenade had come from them and not from Gul-Medin, right? So they cleaned all that up, they erased that forensic evidence. So they brushed away the traces of white explosive powder around Medin's body because the grenade had been thrown at him. So if he had been to throw the grenade, there would be no reason for any white explosive powder to be near his corpse. In a post-mortem photo taken by the unit, one of Medin's figures appears to be missing. Now, Rolling Stone managed to get a hold of these images, along with Der Spiegel. They published an expose. And they reported on the range of images from this and other such shoot-to-kill incidents. And they claimed, quote, in many of the photos, it is unclear whether the bodies are civilians or Taliban. And it's possible that the unidentified deaths involve no illegal acts by U.S. soldiers. Okay, end of quote. So the Rolling Stone basically misses the whole process. They think that, okay, some soldiers were legitimately, some of the victims were legitimate Taliban activists, others were civilian casualties. But however, in making that claim, Rolling Stone, which is a left-wing or liberal progressive newspaper, legitimized the American occupation of Afghanistan as a legality that was detoured by individual criminality. This is the bad apple thesis. And whether you're talking about torture and disappearance in South Africa by the apartheid regime, or the torture of Iraqi civilians at Abu Ghraib, or this particular case, what the state does as part of this process of indemnification and self-immunization is to claim that the individual soldiers, usually low-ranking, who committed a war crime were bad apples, pathological, on drugs, as in this case, they claim that these guys were drug addicts, and they separate them from the command structure that authorized this type of killing in the first place. So Rolling Stone, in making this claim that some of the victims were legitimate and others were illegitimate, misses a critical point. I will argue it is the very admixture of the legal and the illegal, the fact and the artifact, combatant, the blurring of such discriminations, such differences, that was central to the whole enterprise of occupying Afghanistan. The blurring of the legal and the illegal, the fact and the, what I call factuality and actuality of war, was presented as the fact of war versus what is the actual process of waging war, which has to be excluded from any presentation or public presentation of the process of pursuing war. Because the actuality of war will challenge and delegitimize jus ad bellum, or so-called justified war, and would show that in the process of war, there is no jus in bello. So jus ad bellum is justified war. In Latin, jus in bello is justice in war. Not the justice of war, but the justice in war. So this is what my theme is will be today. So in prosecuting these soldiers as aberrant, bad apples, as were the guards in Abu Ghraib in the Iraqi torture, an illegal occupation, a macro illegality under international law, sought juridical coherence in procedural micro-legalities, right? In other words, well, they killed certain people who deserved to be killed, and they committed other crimes. So in this case, Gul-Medin's death and his falsification cannot be dismissed as an atypical, singular, or exceptional occurrence, or as an aberration, or as the work of bad apples. So, this is a dialogue during the prosecution of the soldiers, where they discussed Modi's killing. Of course, all the identities, this was classified, so I don't have names of who's of the testimony. But next to the wall, where did we sit him? Next to the wall. Was he armed? No. That's where Gibbs could get like behind cover after the grenade went off, and then he kind of placed me and over here, outline the sight of this guy. And, he pulled out one of his grenades, an American grenade, popped it into the grenade. So it was an American grenade. And it tells me, all right, the dude, let's watch this guy. So the question here is, how can the right to extrajudicial assassination, which this then falls under, and disappearance, the state that arms itself with this right and the victim of this right be theorized as a legal, political, and visual norm, rather than as an exception or aberration? This thesis reverses the usual philosophical progression by moving from jurisprudence to metaphysics, or to the meta-juridical. The latter implies the violence of the parapolitical that founds both law and the derivative intrinsic violence termed extrajudicial killing. So I want to interrogate extrajudicial assassination as part of the history of rights. Not as a violation of the theory of rights, but as part of the history of rights. And the history of rights, who has right and who does not, is simultaneously the history of subjects who are made and unmade through rights as a mode of political design. Gulbuddin was the target of an extrajudicial assassination, is made the possession of the state through his very targeting. In other words, he becomes Taliban not prior to being targeted, but in the act of targeting, in media res. So his body becomes media of war, not the end of war. See, we think, oh, the killing of the enemy is part of the teleology of the war, the terminus of war. The more we can kill the enemy, the more we can defeat their resistance and we can win the war. But now he becomes a medium of war, not an end, but a means without end. So he's made the possession of the state through his very targeting, killing, and post-mortem photo archiving, mutilation, and visceral erasure. Because in constructing him as Taliban, his biography, his biography, his identity disappears, right? What he was prior to his death, we don't know. This preemptive targeting and the resulting deletions confirm ex post facto his property right by first making from nothing, ec nihilo, the jurisdictional terrain that is to be claimed as objectifying state right within the kingdom of ends. So once you engage in extrajudicial assassination, war ceases to have any moral ground. And what I'm interested in here is the way war constructs its own legitimation, its own ground, from non-ground to unground, or a German Abgrund, called Heidegger. He is the juridical nothingness from which the simulacrum, the property and the propriety, the properness, and iconic power of extrajudicial murder is extracted. This making of dominion is really claiming his body as territory of the American state. Is why the political identity of the victims before they were killed is placed under erasure, and why ex post facto forensic falsification becomes a mechanical reflex, by which merely extends a pre-installed jurisdictional right to fabricate the substrates that will carry political dominion, territory, in these counterfeited bodies. So the body becomes the occupied body. It justifies the presence of American soldiers in Afghanistan. So we have to understand, and I'm giving you a kind of discourse on the history of right. The history of right is the history of a particular will that's elevated to a general will, which has an effective capacity to act. Will is given objective existence by rights. In extrajudicial killing, this will as right is objectified in inflicted death and manufactured corpses as repurposed terrains of jurisdiction and entitlement. In extrajudicial killing, the title to law encompasses the right of necessity and the right of possession as natural rights of dominion. Modine, with the target of extrajudicial assassination, is made a possession of the state through his very targeting, through his killing, through his archiving, mutilation, and visceral erasure. So, then the next stage in this was that the second photograph taken by the soldiers was the playing with the corpse, the reanimation of the corpse. Basically, the soldier, it said, it was like any day of the office. Gibbs, the sergeant in charge of the team, started messing around with the kid, the corpse of Modine, moving his arms and mouth and acting like the kid was talking. And using a pair of razor-sharp medical shears, he reportedly sliced off the dead boy's pinky finger and gave it to Warlock as a trophy for killing his first Afghan. Related to this, so this is a reanimation of the corpse, right? And basically, the construction, the kind of passage that Modine travels from innocent bystander to Taliban terrorist is part of that reanimation process. So related to this, this image is the initial image I showed you. So here the soldier with the biometric camera who looms over the dead eye of the terrorist is like a drone signature strike. It's like a drone weapon. An act in which the lens sucks up and vacuums the body and the subject by removing autonomous agency by placing the animated corpse under the direction of a remote alien will and gaze. And here is a kind of visceral reenactment where this body is like a zombie being controlled by its author. This body has been authored by this soldier, has been constructed. So here, Modine, as a biometrical ghost, becomes an automaton of himself. And Jacques Derrida says, this is a quote from one of his books, "The automaton binds the living. The thing is neither dead nor alive. It is dead and alive at the same time. It survives, at once cunning, inventive, and machine-like, ingenious, and unpredictable. This war machine is a theatrical machine, a mechanic." So we can compare this to the fake sexual tableau of Abu Ghraib, which reanimated the dead flesh. Are you familiar with the Abu Ghraib images? Is anybody not familiar with them? So in the Abu Ghraib images, American soldiers in their photography reanimated the dead flesh of pornographic film in post-cinematic political flesh of their prisoners, and which was again another spectral reanimation of either, in this case, living prisoners as terrorists. So we're dealing with simulacrums. We're dealing with virtual reality. Now this is Der Spiegel's photograph of Modine that they published. Unlike the Rolling Stone, they pixelated his face. But in order to protect his identity or to give him some dignity in death, I'm not sure. I tried to contact Der Spiegel about this when I tried to get rights to these photographs, and they refused to say they did not know where the photographs came from, and they didn't want to explain to me why they pixelated. But I would say this is like the final photograph in the series, a kind of culmination of the saturation of Modine with blur, the blurring of who he was, right? Which exceeds this terminal pixelation and is the walk that threads the fatal trajectory of his body from the very moment of his acquisition as an attackable surface for the military and its media. So he was blurred and being set up as a Taliban attacker in the digital abstraction and amputation of his body's fragments, and as the Pentagon's suppression of his murder and his photographic forensic record, and later, at last, in the facial pixelation by Der Spiegel. So there was a constant blurring of the image, rendering it unstable. And here I want to talk about this for a moment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of John Tagg, The Burden of Representation. He talks about how photography becomes, in the 19th century, evidentiary. Yes, how does photography become evidence in law, in medicine, in psychiatry? And he uses two terms that are very important here. I should have them on the screen.
One is typification, T-Y-I-P-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, and the other one is frontality. And he argued that in the kind of portrait photography practiced by prisons, psychiatric institutions, hospitals, poorhouses, orphanages in the 19th century, that the photographs that constitute the dossiers, the case histories of the inmates, were not portraits of individuals. They were portraits of types, specimens, and the photography was used to construct types, criminal types, mentally ill types, foreigners, indigent, poor, different types of disease. If you're familiar with Charcot, photography of Charcot, the psychiatric forensic photography of Charcot itself here, again, is a display of hysterical women, major history in gender studies, and the controlling of their bodily posture to produce a certain specimen. So you don't look at the individual body, you read across a series of bodies. So here, again, typification is constructing the terrorist body. And despite the digital biometrical technological advancement, basically this type of photography goes back as a genealogy in 19th century criminal and psychiatric photography. And the second concept that Tag talks about is frontality, F-R-O-N-T-A-L-I-T-Y, by which it means, why is it the face? Why the fixation on the face? How does the face become the, Francisco was telling me now, the vehicle for identity authentication is DNA, but the logic, the way DNA is being used today, is exactly how the face, and later on the fingerprint, was used in the 19th century to authenticate identity. And what in my own thinking about frontality, I argue that the frontal part of the body, the face, is literally surgically detached from the rest of the body. The rest of the body is considered excrement, surplus, illegible, inadmissible. We don't need it, dysfunctional. All we need is this part of the body in order to create authenticated identity. The face becomes the signature of the body in the absence of any person who would sign an autograph, a photograph to authenticate its identity and authenticity. The face becomes the signature of the person from which it is surgically, photographically, and visually severed and separated. So we have to understand the physics of the visual here. So I'd argue that the political expropriation of Modine's body is inseparable from a kind of chain, a signifying network of blurring effects that made of Modine a forensic revenant, right? A revenant is, this is contradiction in terms. A revenant is kind of like a reanimated ghost or a corpse, right? That haunts people. It doesn't remain stable. So I'm kind of reanimating. I'm maybe asking you to rethink the notion of the corpse, the forensic corpse, as simply dead, as simply an object, as simply a reified thing, and to think about what Jacques Derrida calls survivance, survivance. Something that's neither dead nor alive, but something in between. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, in turn, the ratcheting up of blurring, blotting, and smudging that enchained Modine's incorporeality, because the body is disposed of, that renders it politically presentifiable, effectively generates a body that appears under erasure. It appears, but it appears under erasure. This is why it's a denegated body. A denegation is negation that does not resolve into a higher resolution. When we think of Hegel, the negation of negation produces an affirmation. A denegated body is a denegation. It simply stays in a negative state, oscillates between what negates it and what is negated, the negating and negated. And it keeps on going back and forth. It doesn't resolve into any positive identity or affirmation. So his body is denegated because it renounces in its very presence its visual emanation. Its very visibility collapses into invisibility if we take the full history of these photographs, not just what's presented to the Pentagon. His body is stretched across a spectrum of the visible and the invisible, and yet is unstably so at either pole of the visible and the invisible. His body is distended along the curvature of a commerce between disembodying visual acquisition by various powers, and both political, military, and mediatic, and a now defaced and totally inaccessible, destructible, subjective life that we no longer have access to, except maybe through his family. So, historical witness, this is what I mean by a war against the witnessing of war. The historical witness is confronted here with a self-effacing double exposure of the body. An overexposure marked by terror, stigma, and death, and an underexposure that makes of the once-lived body a secret without a body. I'll repeat that again. Historical, let me get this up. Okay. So Modine's body is denegated to the degree that it is stretched across the visible and the invisible, yet is unstably so at either locus. So historical witness is confronted here with a self-effacing double exposure of the body. An overexposure marked by terror, stigma, and death, and an underexposure that makes of the once-lived body a secret without a body. I should smuggle in a kind of YouTube-type advertisement here and saying, all this is in my book, so you can purchase the book rather than taking photographs of the slides. Okay. So I'm going to skip ahead because we're running out of time, because I want to relate Modine's So one last statement. In the murder of Gul Modine, the infused staining blur captures the entry and force and power of into the body, right? What I'm going to argue is that blurring is also, in a kind of counter reading of these images. The blurring, the fragmentation of the body, is instability between the visible and the invisible. It's flotation between these two polarities, between light and non-light. Phos in Greek and aphos. It registers the entry of sovereignty, of a sovereign power into the body that destroys the body. And this body can neither fully present, contain, nor condition this surplus materiality and immateriality of such sovereign invasion. Here, an excess leaves a gap, an interval, a trace, a saturation in that which cannot hold this mark except as a wound in the field and vision of the gaze of the spectator. This is a wound in our vision, because we cannot stabilize this photograph as an object. But we know the full story, but we know the full history of its production. And of course, visual realism is the ideological we have to begin to critique here, because one of the core principles of visual realism, of photographic realism, is to disguise the conditions of its production. Realism pretends to be naturalized, right? Those of you who are familiar with the theory of the male gaze, right, which is a famous theory in gender studies, which talks about how most representations of women's bodies historically in Western art, pornography, cinema, is created by men, right? Part of that production of the gendered body, woman's body, is naturalization of that gaze. And if you denaturalize their gaze, and realize that realism is unnatural, it's a construct, and has particular conditions of production, then in this case, the stability that we associate with the realist object, the visual object, is not available to us, right? So the blur leaves a wound in the field of vision in the gaze of the spectator as the possible witness. You think you're witnessing Taliban, but you're not. And you can no longer witness the Gul Modine that was destroyed in order to make the Taliban. So what are we looking at now? Who are we looking at? And who are we in this particular situation? Because if you remember the very famous quote by Gilles Deleuze, in order to be a spectator, to be a subject of the visual, you already have to be inscribed in a visual field. And this is what the war apparatus is doing, is describing any possible potential weaknesses within a structured visual field that it wants to control, in which it's going to guard the invisible in the visible. See, security, securitization, or what my South African colleagues call securocracy, synthesizing bureaucracy and security, is about guarding the invisible in the visible, what you cannot see, and making sure that you cannot see. It's about the presentation of threat, which at the same time is also drawing your attention away from other types of threat. So for example, in the United States, the vast majority of terrorist acts have not been committed by Muslim jihadis associated with Taliban or ISIS or any other organizations you can name, but rather by right-wing, white, American, racist extremists. Right? But the threat is always the foreign other, the Mexican rapist, according to Trump, right? Which is a version of alien terrorists, or the Sikh who wears a turban and a beard, right? So drawing your attention away from where the real threat is, as opposed to, and controlling the apparition of threat, which is controlling the visible and the invisible at the same time. And also making invisible how threat is made to appear in front of a public eye. So the saturating blur is an incision that marks a simultaneously excision, a locus of disfiguration. And that's what I'm talking about, the disfiguration that is involved in the making of this image. Beyond the frame, as a condition of the frame. The blur and pointing beyond the frontality shown gestures towards a remainder, a surplus, an exercise becoming as an immateriality that supports, backs, and really advances the corporeality and objectivity of the photographic reel. If we see the photographic reel as material, then I argue that all this counterfeiting, this forensic falsification, is an immateriality that supports this material construct. So though the killing team assembled a biometric body, they placed his biography, his real identity, under erasure. Thus, I would argue that his death falls under the category of enforced disappearance. We're used to living people being disappeared, being executed, later having their bodies burnt or buried. But this is where a dead body is already a subject of disappearance. And the dead body is visible, but the living body, the person behind that, who wants to have that dead body, is rendered, erased and rendered invisible and disappeared. Now, practices and campaigns of disappearance are linked to the spatial and visual logic of genocide. They're kind of micro-genocides. And this is one of the legacies of the Holocaust, that now we have like miniature genocides, incomplete genocides. And programs of disappearance, but they differ, and I'm going to specify the difference here. In programs of disappearance, as with genocide, one part of the population claims a nomos of the earth. I'm deliberately quoting the work of Carl Schmitt, who says that politics is predicated on territoriality, on territorialization. The whole concept of the nation state exhibits a war of the earth, right? When Trump says we don't want Mexican rapists crossing our borders and we are going to build a wall, he's exercising a law of the earth, right? The earth is inscribed with nationalist, nation-civic boundaries and borders and metaphysics. And in programs of disappearance, one part of the population claims the nomos of the earth for itself and denies the other the right to habitus, denies the other the right to the surface of the earth. Think about that. That's not included in the discourse of human rights, the right to exist on the surface of the earth. They deny the right to habitus, cartographic legitimacy, and spatial security. Hannah Arendt supported the capital penalty for Adolf Eichmann based on the principle that he was complicit in an apparatus of deportation and extermination that denied the rights of Jews to share the earth with the Germans. Genocide is impermissible, but we have no choice with whom to cohabit on the earth. This was Arendt's argumentation. We have no choice with whom to cohabit on the earth. Spatial diversity as existential fact and ethical a priori precedes birth and cohabitation. Both genocide and enforced disappearance attack the right to appear on the earth and classify persons and populations as improper to the terrestrial surface. A regime of vanishment, and this Boumediene was a part of a regime of vanishment, it is counterfeiting, forensic falsification, as is enforced disappearance in places like Chile and Argentina. A regime of vanishment defaces any evidence of the victim's present and prior terrestrial anchorage. The proprietary right of the nation-state is advanced through the serial voiding of a right to the earth for the vanished in large groups or in individual series, as in the case of these clandestine assassinations. And I would argue that the clandestine organization of disappearance, the fact that disappearance in many countries disguises itself as such, in this case by counterfeiting the victim of disappearance as a terrorist, in other cases by denying that the state had any involvement with the disappearance. If you read Jacobo Timmerman's famous book, Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number, he talks about the silence that haunts the communities from which the disappeared have been subtracted. Because no one wants to talk about it, because if you talk about it, you'll be the next person to be banished by the state. This silent, so a state attests to the clandestine organization of disappearance, attests to the power privation of the simulacrum that seeks to be ungraspable and intangible. The silent state disapparition of force magnifies fear through the expansion of the powers of self-virtualization. This apparatus of disframing inclusion grips the living, made missing, and intensifies the radiating reach of its political dispositivity as a mode of motion of warfare. Is to make people appear, but make them appear as under erasure. So they need a living or dead, present or absent, with somewhere in between. Now, the publicness of certain genocidal operations is precipitated by large-scale infrastructural mobilization and justifying propaganda. In contrast, enforced disappearance is frequently randomized, accidentalized, silenced, and rendered unmotivated and incordial. Oh, the person just wanted to leave his family. We don't know what happened to the person. We had him under custody, but he escaped. Or we had him under custody, but he was released, right? And I call this randomization or accidentalization of disappearance, the disappearance of disappearance. And we have to ask ourselves, what type of forms of power are being built by states who practice disappearance and also practice the disappearance of its disappearance? Render it deniable. Perpetuate its impunity by saying it didn't occur. In South Africa, when I was studying the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I interviewed many mothers and families of the disappeared there. And I asked them the question, well, do you think that the Truth Commission is going to generate reconciliation between the races? And invariably, the answer I got from these survivors of the disappeared was, we don't know anything about reconciliation. What we do know is they're referring to are the whites and the public culture and the mass media, but they can no longer say that this did not happen. We have to think about that. What does it mean to live in a history of 20, 30 years in which the existential events of losing family members has no public anchorage? It did not happen. No public visibility. Denied by the state, denied by the law courts, not reported in the media. To live with the loss of loss. Because disappearance is the loss. The disappearance of disappearance is the loss of loss. You don't not even, society does not even know what it has lost in the disappearing of its citizens. So, both in the disappearance of disappearance, both the vanished and the act of vanishment are literally placed under erasure, not completely voided, but subsumed under the quasi-opacity of a retraction and redaction of an act that's rescripted as a nondescript mishap. This is what I call the accidentalization of war. And think of collateral damage, the logic of collateral damage. And those who are treated as a nondescript mishap will then become procedurally nondescript under law. Disappearance and its aftermath are designed to inhibit the capacity of political and legal witness to catch its causality in the act. And we can see that explicitly in the forensic falsification of Gulmodine. The anonymization of the missing achieves the dephenomenalization and de-manifestation of the event that persists as a public secret, whose force lies in its political and epistemological remotion, its distance from everyday life, its distance from public and civic institutions. So here we talk about the disappearance machine as any machine, as again I'm quoting from Jacques Derrida, whose work influenced my work on disappearance, as cut any machine or apparatus of disappearance is cut as well as cutting regard to the living present of life or the living body. It is an effect of the cut as much as it is the cause of the cut. I'll talk about that in a moment. Why does the body become the cause of disappearance? Derrida here speaks of bodies as insectum in Latin, which means cutting into and sectioning. To have the body divided into segments, to insect it, is to separate, to dissect, and to intersect, and to hunt and catch insects. So here the body is cut off. Here Gulmodine is cut off from his own body. The disappeared in being rendered culpable, guilty of what we do not know, culpable, become cuttable, and cut off from society, family, their bodies, biographies, and deaths. Because in a lot of times with disappearance, there is no certified death. Whether an occurrence authored by an executive power becomes an event or non-event is here a matter of random dehistoricization. The disappearance of disappearance is passed off as the elliptical action of a non-action in which the disappeared becomes ciphers. So the disappearance captures dynamics that we are familiar with in anthropology that were first or initially discussed by Orlando Patterson on his famous book, Slavery and Social Death, which is the fact that the slave experiences a living death in being a slave, and the disappeared too are subjected to a social death. And this social death cloaks not only the disappeared, but their families and their peers. They are afflicted with a living death that beyond any biological certainty is a socially and politically enforced interstitiality, liminality of the truth, an erasure of life without its documented termination. The missing suspended within an attenuated life-death world of abduction, detention, decertified death, and maybe inhumation or incineration undergo a social death. Now, social death for Patterson, when he's discussing this in relation to slavery, is a change what he called natal alienation, in which the disappeared, like the enslaved, are forcibly estranged from the natality, from their birth, right? From the identity that accrues from their birth, and all of its biosymbolic nuances that have been explicated by Arendt. Arendt saw natality not just tied to biological birth, but with the capacity to bring something new into the world. And for her, political innovation was based on natality, the ability to innovate, to bring something new into the world. And once the disappeared are subtracted, they can no longer bring something new into the world. Natal alienation removes the disappeared from the sites of their birth as kin, subjects, and citizens, from their ascendants, descendants, and from the general bio-political condition of natio. Natio is Latin for birth, is also the root word for nation, that constitutes the civil subject in the nation state. Am I going too fast? For Arendt, natality is not just biological, as I said, but it's about bringing something new into the world, to initiate the unprecedented and the unrepeated. This temporal possibility, too, is denied the disappeared and their stranded survivors. And we have to understand, let's not, I was talking about this with Francisco, he's talking about this new practice of returning the remains of the disappeared to the families. And immediately I said, well, this is the reprivatization of the disappeared, because what the families undergo is a privatization, an enforced privatization and atomization of their memory of the disappeared. And here, the work of Francis Barker is very important I don't know if you know Francis Barker. He was a Shakespeare scholar, and he working with the Shakespearean tragedies. And he talked about that, for him, Shakespeare was important because of how memory was being treated in the plays like Hamlet, or Macbeth, or King Lear, right? And he talked about what has gone. Shakespeare was able to pinpoint a pathology of modernity, where memory had been polarized and reduced to two basic forms. One was privatized memory, which is not private construction, because it's the most socially constructed condition possible, right? Artifice, completely, usually by political institutions. The alienation, the privatization of memory, what I call in my work cultural anesthesia, where you no longer are able to communicate in the public culture your sensorial experience. Like my South African performance who said they can no longer say this did not happen. When they lived under the apartheid regime, whole reams of political experience, violence and terror literally did not occur, did not happen. The loss of loss. And so Barker said, on one side, we have the extreme privatization and atomization and anonymization of memory. And on the other side, we have commemoration, memory, remembering together. And then here comes the hitch, right? He beautifully describes these two forms of memory. And he says, but neither gives us access to history. They prevent us from historical reconstruction. He saw them as obstacles, not a facilitation. It was a major critique of the whole memory studies industry that he was presenting through Shakespeare. Neither remembering together, the healing of collective, what do we call it again, trauma tropology, or privatization of memory gives us access to history. They are obstacles to historical reconstruction. So, the missing are not only abducted and vanished for what they have done and said. I'm talking about they are abducted and vanished not only for what they have done and said, and not even for who they are. In the case of Gulbuddin, he was rendered missing for who he was, and many times not even for that. But they are abducted for what they can politically become. Prevent that political becoming. If unwilled proximity and unchosen cohabitation are preconditions of political existence, we cannot have any politics. We cannot have political existence without unwilled proximity to others, unchosen cohabitation. Then, without those conditions, there is no political existence possible. And forced and disavowed disappearance inflicts a contretemps on an accident, a mishap, on the very possibility of the political, with the banishment of potential political interlocutors from the earth. And now we have to ask ourselves, why a state apparatus wants to disappear, erase potential political interlocutors. And this is the logic of war today. But certainly it has a history that goes further back than the War of Terror. So, examining disappearance needs to attend to the sensory content of a phantasm in which the vanished have disappeared outside of the disappearance. And one of the other aspects I want you to think about, as well as natal alienation and social death, is anthropophagy, social political cannibalism. A tropology of devourment orders a regime of banishment. An autonomic cannibalism where the disappeared, the event of their disapparition, and the social-cultural memory of the event are mechanically and voraciously consumed by an executive power. Are you understanding what I'm saying here? Are you grasping this? Social political cannibalism. This is what the state disappearance is, the eating of its own citizens. A state consumes its own citizens. And it denies that they even had the meal. It denies that they regurgitated the meal in the form of mass secret burial graves or mass burnings of bodies. And I'm thinking here of the film, which I know you've seen, Nostalgia for the Light by Patricio Guzman, and the way bodies were made to disappear in the Atacama Desert. Disappearance is the intestinal cannibalism of a political order that, that's recognizable in Hobbes' discussion of civil war. Hobbes, when he discussed civil war in Leviathan, described it as an intestinal discord, like stomach ache of this body politic. Only the cannibal can be truly inhuman in devouring within his own species. The cannibalism of sovereignty is an act of political speciation. This is what occurred with Gulmuddin. He's speciated as a terrorist. His individuality, his singularity is erased, and he becomes Taliban. He becomes a terrorist, a species. The cannibalism of sovereignty is an act of political speciation both within and beyond the human. Irrespective of its structural indifference, institutional mechanisms and designed a causality, the regime of vanishment requires human cogs and inhumanity to advance its veracity for names and bodies, taking names and taking bodies and erasing them. Now, Michael Tausig, some of you might be know of this work in Colombia on terrorism in the Putumayo Valley, in a brilliant book which should be read called Shamanism, Cannibalism, Wildman, and the Wildman. He discusses the fact of the fear of the cannibal. The cannibal is a kind of civilizational trope of the colonial and the post-colonial regime, and how the other is always going to be devouring the self, right? So he talked about these kind of neo-colonial phobias of the cannibal as an hallucinogenic recreation of the fantasized anti-self in the self, right? In other words, the self that feels is going to be threatened by this alien other, like Trump fearing the Mexican rapists, or the Trump supporters being put in fear of the Mexican rapists creeping over the borders into their bedrooms at night to rape white women. That kind of fear of the cannibal is a kind of transverse mimesis, right? That it politically embodies the fear of being consumed by difference, right? But the discourse on the cannibal is a discourse about the fear of being consumed by difference, being assaulted by alterity, that the xenophobic victim mimetically becomes. So can we think of programs of enforced disappearance as the consumption of difference that is seen as potentially engulfing, a kind of preemptive or apotropaic consumption of difference that is about to engulf each you, right? We eat the other before he eats or she eats us. With this explain the interdiction of neutrality as the foreclosure of future political interlocutors. There's no doubt that the regime of disappearance narrates and maps and itemizes difference in those it wipes off the face of the earth. Despite its ultimate project dispersal, it must cast its nets over time and space in order to arrest and master difference. This begs the question of under what historical conditions does difference become so ubiquitous, so generic as to be implanted in the masses of the nondescript in excess of any threat to security, of any doubtable political antagonism, as in the case of Gulmuddin. He was not Taliban, he was a threat to no one. Returning to Michael Tausig's mimetic cannibalism, it can be suggested that the regime of banishment turns to political cannibalism not only to preemptively consume difference, to make the difference to which it can be opposed and to be seen to tame. I'm going to cut very quickly to the end because we're very late. So, one thing remains, and I want to return back to Gulmuddin. Which you haven't dealt with, right? This anonymous signature, archival artifact, and posthumous autograph that remains in its enucleated and atomized ruin. The amputated figures of the striker platoon's victims, including possibly those of Gulmuddin, which glow with an historical dark light. This is what we have left of it, the amputated fingers. And in many cases of exhumation, it's only fragments of the body that remains, not the whole body. Friedrich Hegel writes in the Phenomenology, the Geist ist ein Knochen, the spirit is the bone. I think this should be the model for critical forensic research. The spirit is the bone. The bone is not the bone, the spirit is the bone, and the bone is the spirit. How can we develop a forensics around that maxim, around that principle. The Geist is like, the spirit is the bone. In the aftermath of disappearance, only bones remain as signatures of the spirit and as remaining emptiness of the war on terror, or other wars on terror. The bone as object stands for the evacuated signifier that was the aphorized terrorist, or Taliban, as its material yet spectral trace. The spirit bone in question here, the amputated finger fragment, kept as an archival miniature by his executioner, subsists within the interspace of two deaths. Dos muertes, no, two deaths of Medina. Death by firing squad and his disappearance by image and biometric archive. Material death and the immaterial virtual death. The bone remains and glows as an interspatial spirit, as that which is not to be enclosed in the overproduction of images and objects, the counterfeiting, overreaching network that bears Modine's name and that signed his life and his death away. Disappeared both his life and his death. The amputated finger is the spirit as bone and as a returning, unmanned, ghostly drone of his disfigured death. So here's the forensic revenant returning, what Derrida calls ontology, as a returning historical ghost, as unresolved history, unreconciled history. The spirit bone, the spirit bone captures an impossible recuperation. It points to the immeasurable distance between Gobaldin from all the iconic photographic phantasms and political surplus extracted from his sterilized death, as that which indicates his irreducible autonomy and singularity, as Modine's unrecognizable echo vibrating between death and life. In this place, we're recollecting, recalling, and mourning Modine, like Modine. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I'm sure people of the audience have any questions.
To get started, I think we need a couple of hours to kind of process all you've said, which is quite a lot. And I have many things like going around my mind, but not clear question. So I was very interested in this idea you were kind of putting forward about the wound in our vision.
Yeah.
Because that really interests us, because I usually use it, but in a way less sophisticated way than you've done today. Basically to encrypt the excess of saturation of violence that we are exposed. I mean, our eyes are totally saturated with catastrophes, and not again for the humanitarian actors, that's a problem, because when they want to raise money, fundraising for catastrophe or whatever, they don't know what image to use, for example,
Right.
to draw empathy, because we run out of empathy.
Right.
You need like a really terrible image, just to move people into giving money to the bank account. But I think this is important because we're talking about the regimes of this that we do. So this is one thing. So, but I also wanted to ask you about a couple of questions. Like you've been talking mostly, if I understood, about the way in which the military apparatus is kind of effacing the
Self-effacing one.
Self-effacing one. Okay. So one of the questions is like, do you see? I mean, obviously we are influenced by this reading, and it's being kind of encrypted into our vision. But is there like a basis of autonomy that?
Of course.
And if you could talk a little bit about other regimes of visuality which are alternate or opposing this one. Like, I don't know if it's like word journalism or video art, or I don't know exactly where you can find these counter images which kind of restore the fuzziness we were talking about, which is really terrible. And I was also wondering about another kind of route I would like you to comment on. It has to do with what's called now the forensic term, or the CSI effect.
Yeah.
The extent to which these forensic iconographies, this forensic imaginary, has captured our way, our connection to the past and to violence. No? And if you are talking now about falsifying the forensics, no? I think that's a very important term in the sense that there is also like a consciousness of perpetratorhood that might fit something that could be said.
Of course.
Because it reminded me quite a bit about what happened in Srebrenica, for example, during the massacres of Srebrenica, in which the bodies were also dispersed in a similar way, in which, I mean, physically dispersed and blurred, in a similar way in which you are talking about war images. And that's more kind of, it's closer to the war. I mean, these are just like disconnected comments that, I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, it'll take an hour to answer those. What was the first question again?
Well, it was, it was about the wound in the vision.
The wound in the vision. Yeah, I adopted that model from the work of Jean-Luc Marion, who writes about religious icons and miracles. And he talks about the fact that the miracle, the visual experience of a miracle in theology and religious writings, talks about, robs you of the sovereignty of your spectatorship, and that the image of the miracle hits you in a counter-intentional manner. In other words, and he talks about saturation of blur. He talks about these saturated images that resist being stabilized as an object. Okay? And then I applied that. I'm sure he'd be completely shocked and disgusted. I applied that to war. You know? And I also use this theological concept from early Christianity called apophatics. Apophatics was this practice of religious early Christian mystics who would kind of write this poetry where they were trying to describe God, right? But the whole purpose of writing these descriptions of God was to show that God was indescribable, that all these descriptions were failed descriptions, right? And basically the effect of showing all these failed representational, referential attempts was to show that God was indescribable, and you give up trying to describe God. He exceeds all representational apparatuses. And I, again, in a very perverse manner, have applied that to the sovereignty of the war apparatus, the state, the sovereign state. Saying the state is now practicing an apophatics of war, where it wants to represent war as ultimately indescribable and unwitnessable. And that's why you have the wound in the vision. Because we identify vision with truth. It's a critique of the Enlightenment project. So, for example, in issue of disappearance, human rights and international law discourse basically sees a state that practices disappearance as aberrant and that has basically suspended its civil and juridical proceduralism, right? And that if you restore them, you can heal that state. The question I asked is different. I asked, what forms of power is sovereignty accruing by practicing disappearance? Rather than seeing it as an aberration or a state of exception, so I'm completely disagreeing with Giorgio Agamben, you're familiar with his work. I do not advocate a state of exception. I argue that the state is accruing forms of power, new forms of power by this type of war that subtracts itself, that retracts itself in this act. So I call this, after Nietzsche, the will to unwill, right? In this case, the state has a will to unwill its violence, practices a will to unwill its violence. Now, unwilling violence in this case is not to choose nonviolence or pacifism over aggression, rather is to make of one's violence a nonviolence. See? So in the case of Modine, he was fabricated as the aggressor. So the American soldiers were merely acting in self-defense. See? That's how you make of your violence a nonviolence. Right? So erasing violence as such. And we know, I mean, if we think of peace, right? How do we define peace? Peace is merely the absence of war. And Foucault has this famous quote that in writing the history of peace, we're really writing the history of war. So we don't have a definition of peace. So war is colonized peace. Peace now becomes war by other means. The issue about choosing what type of images are effective versus what type of images are not effective, it's not a question of different images or different technologies of the image. I remember you mentioned Srebrenica. I remember this incredible scene in this film by Jean-Luc Godard called Notre Music, where he teaches a film class. And the theme, I have it discussed in my book, he has a thing called shot, reverse shot, which shows how history is perceptually organized around a shot and then a reverse shot. And at the end of the film class, he's asked by one of the students, a Bosnian student, do you think that the new portable video technology will be the answer to this kind of dominant visual regimes perpetuated by the news media in Hollywood? And the response to Godard is silence. No answer, because he knows it's not determined by technology. It's how we read images and how we teach people to work with images and how we critique images. It's about doing image work, and it's hard. And humanitarian NGOs don't want to do that type of work. They want to show and expose and shame, and it's not working. And the verification of it's not working is what could have been more shocking than the Abu Ghraib images of sexually predicated torture, sexual abuse. In the 1960s, when French intellectuals like Vidal Naquet exposed French torture in Algeria, it really contributed to the end of the French counterinsurgency in Algeria. It created a major scandal in France at the time. When the Abu Ghraib photographs were exposed in the public media and generated military court-martials and things like that, the war on terror went on. It's still going on for another 10 or 12 years. It didn't do anything to end that war. People are inured to those images. One of my students did research on the Abu Ghraib images and how they were mediated into American culture. And you know the famous one of the guy with the pointed hood standing on a box with wires dangling from his finger? That turned up as a children's Halloween costume. The year after the show, it was publicized in the media. So how do we work with those type of images? How do we show, if you've not seen the film 13th by Anne DuVernay, it traces, 13th is the amendment of the U.S. Constitution that prohibited outlaw slavery, with the exception of criminals. Right? If you're convicted of a crime, you can be subject to the conditions of slavery or being in prison. Right? And she discusses the whole history of how the kind of criminalization of African American populations was needed in the aftermath of the abolishment of slavery to manage what you call black bodies, black mobilities. And she goes all the way through up to the contemporary period to what is now called by people like Ruth Gilmore, the prison industrial complex, where we have the highest prison population in African Americans and in the world, one of the highest prison populations in the world, and a disproportionate percentage of African Americans. But at the end of this film, she shows images of black people being ejected from Trump rallies. Black protesters who were being beaten and ejected, and the reaction of the univocally white supporters of Trump. And she montages those images of black protesters being violently evicted from Trump rallies with the beating of civil rights activists in the South in the 1950s and 60s. That was powerful. That really shocked people. Because that kind of historical compression, what Benjamin called the dialectical image, where the past and the present cohere into the now, right? With Benjamin called Jetztzeit in German, now time, right? Which showed where the historical genealogy of Trump lies, right? That is the type of critique we have to do. It's not going to be in the kind of Hollywood of realistic space, getting more grotesque images, because what's going on with that overexposure of images is what I call cultural anesthesia. And this goes back, if I may lecture you a little bit, in the history of visual culture, to the work of Ernst Junger, who basically talks about photography, particularly the photography war, of creating a second colder consciousness. And Junger was the first to kind of bring up this issue of desensitization, but he did it with a twist. Usually we think of, okay, desensitization through media, through video or photography, enables us to transform the world and to people's suffering, thinking of Susan Sontag's book, The Suffering of Others, right, into objects. It facilitates the transforming of the other into an object, you know, in which we are capable of feeling the pain of the other, the anesthesiology of this type of imagery. Junger recognized that. He also said the second colder consciousness also increases our capacity to turn ourselves into objects. We have to look at ourselves as spectators. How we objectify ourselves as sovereign spectators, as privileged spectators. Paco showed me these maps on the first floor of Madrid, right? I just come from Andalusia. I saw a similar map in Cadiz. If you go to the town hall of Cadiz, you see a map that you look at from above. The notion of the disembodied panoptical sovereign spectator who sees everything in panorama, right? We have to resituate vision. We have to situate the conditions of possibility of the photograph, of the image. We have to localize it, to get back into local history. And of course we start with the fate of the body. Now there's a third question that you asked me, I lost track of. Maybe we should allow the people.
Yeah, we should go open up the floor. We can go back to.
You can ask me anything I've discussed, and I use any terms that you didn't understand, like more translation. You know, 'cause I know I'm a New Yorker. You tend to speak very fast English. So I apologize in retrospect.
I'd like to talk about the scene created by Gibbs and these things that made me think of the figure of the executioner and the relation between the executioner and the sovereign. I know this is more related to than of politics, but I think it might also be applied to this case. I'm thinking here in Roger Caillois, who used to work with me. He said that there is a duality between the executioner and the sovereign. He argues that both of them represent the two opposite poles of a society, who are in charge of maintaining harmony and stability of an authoritarian state in different ways. They are in conflict with each other as antagonistic but also symmetrical. And the veneration of one is the ignominy of the other. While one is adored, the other is hated and feared as sacred figures, but in an opposite way. They are a symbolic couple, and together they guarantee society's cohesion. The executioner has to carry out death sentence signed by the sovereign, so while the sovereign benefits from all the honors linked to his power, the executioner has to carry the weight of the sins, which are necessarily connected to the exercise of authority. And I wonder how much of the case of Maddie and Sergeant Gibbs is related to this theory. How Gibbs and his team are just the executioners.
What's the word you mean, Gibbs?
Yeah, Gibbs, the sergeant.
Gibbs,
Gibbs,
okay.
sorry. Gibbs. And his team are just the executioners of a wide power and disciplinary sphere where they embody the evil and in order to save and free the sovereign of any guilt, but also society as a whole. I also ask myself that if Gibbs is the executioner, then who is the sovereign nowadays? And I don't know, I just wonder.
Okay, I would say this model is outdated. It actually comes from Bataille. Maybe co-hours is thinking about Bataille's work. And this is the model that both Derrida and Agamben talked about, but in a different way, because the position of the executioner of the sovereign is that the sovereign is not completely part of society, he or she or it governs. The executioner exists as a kind of threshold concept of the margins of society as well. And that these two threshold figures define a stable social order. They're the extreme ends of the social order. In the case of Agamben, there's the sovereign and that of the homo sacer, bare life, or the Musulman in his book on the Auschwitz, right? The sovereign, or in the case of Derrida, he talks in his book, the sovereign and the beast and the sovereign. The sovereign, it can become a beast in war, in torture, in disappearance, right? But they both exist at the thresholds, but are not completely part of the society they govern. But what I'm arguing here is that sovereign is not a, we have to get rid of our notion of sovereignty that's predicated on the model of the subject. And that's what I do in my book. Here, sovereignty is embodied in situ, in performative acts. And here I'm influenced by Michel Foucault. Of course, Foucault rejected a model of power based on repressive violence. The notion of violence that immobilizes and flattens out, which was a normal model, the kind of Marxist model of violence, of power. And he argued for, and also the fact that power emanated from a central space or a central place, an Archimedean point, and that and that institutions draw on portions of power or dosages of power as if you were taking money out of the bank account, right? Reserved side from which it emanated to the extremes of the society, and the sovereign would be the kind of personification of that stable central Archimedean point of power. Foucault argued for the decentralization of power and the embedding. He talked about effective power, by which he meant power in situ, power in performance, and power that's enacted in its performance. The sovereignty that is produced and generated in its performance. So when I argued that the right to judicial assassination was manufactured in and through the body of the victim, did not precede the production of that body. It was manufactured in and through the body of the victim, and is an effect of that body. There's no pre-existing sovereignty. It's created in situ through various actions, and the body and the sovereignty becomes an effect of power, not the cause of power. It's a sovereign effect or a power effect. So Foucault saw society must be defended, and other of his books, these acts, decentralized acts of performance of power. For example, he was, are you familiar with Discipline and Punish? Okay, because everybody knows this book. When he was asked why he focused in that book on the visual and on the body, why he brought them together, he said because by coupling them together in the panopticon, in the prison, you had you produced an uninterruptible power, a continuum of power between the visual and the body. This is a performative model of power. And the origin of this model actually comes from Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morals. In his parable of the lightning, right? He said, he identified as one of the great metaphysical assumptions of Western political theory, the sentence, the lightning strikes. He said that's pure metaphysics. When we say the lightning strikes, we have doubled the doer behind the doing. We have put a doer behind the doing. We put an agent behind the action. Rather, there is no agent behind the action. The lightning is its own agent. The lightning strikes. It's a tautology. Right? That's how we understand power. We have to have a doer behind the doing. The doer is not the author. Foucault rejected an authorial model of power. The authorial aspect is an effect of power. It's an authorial effect. There's an authorial effect. Power produces effects in bodies. You have to have bodies. That's why I argued about the fracturing of the body, that this kind of blurring and saturation and destabilization of the body as we can access it through the image registers the entry of a sovereign power into the body, and a body that cannot contain it, cannot really contain that, and it shows, and the sovereign power shows itself in its destruction in the destructibility of the body, but also shows its immateriality, the fact that that body can never really fully express or personify or represent that power, or be the carrier of that body, or encapsulate that power. So that in materializing itself, sovereign power shows itself as also simultaneously immaterial. In concretizing itself in a particular object, like Omadine's body, or the body of the disappeared, particularly the body of the disappeared, where the sovereign or executive power is disappearing, is disappearances, right? It's becoming pure effect, pure virtual reality, right? The disappear vanished, and you don't know, you cannot catch its causality in the act. And sovereign power both exists and vanishes at the same time. And this is the new form of power that I associate with securitizing power. Because unlike repressive power that wants to put an end to disorder, securitization wants to perpetuate disorder. It wants to manage disorder. It doesn't want to abolish disorder. Because without difference, without disorder, there has no justification for its existence. So the focus of securitocratic power is to reproduce the anomaly, is to engage in anomaly detection. It's to reproduce the anomaly. So you think of like all the alarms and warning bells, you know, oh, pink alert, red alert, yellow alert, right? The kind of fear, you know, like, you know, with each bombing, with each attack, and the tightening up, the ratcheting up of repressive legislation. What happens is that this is called the apotrope, right? That, you know, in Greek theater, when they did all these Greek tragedy in 5th century Africa, they showed all these murders like in Oedipus Rex or in Antigone. They had a figure of the Gorgon, right? It was an apotrope figure. The Gorgon's figure was a horrific face. It was supposed to scare away any evil spirits that would contaminate the political community when they were witnessing these crimes on stage. These alarms, they're kind of apotropes. They're like these Gorgons that fabricate danger and threat before it happens, right? And it doesn't, and it promises one thing, that it will control threat through its repetition, through its apotropaic or preemptive repetition. So I don't think that model really is pertainable anymore. There is no stable sovereign site. They cannot, the executioner and the sovereign can no longer anchor each other. Gibbs, they're executioners, but they are enabled by a very complicated command structure that also divorces itself from what they're doing as they are doing it. And I learned this in South Africa, and I attended the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where I was listening to the testimony of white soldiers who were torturers, who were engaged in disappearance, who were applying for amnesty. And they talked about their victims in such depersonalized, bureaucratized, disaffected ways. It kind of robotic ceremonial language. And I realized this was a language they inherited from within their organizational culture as they were killing people, as they were disappearing people, as they were burning their bodies, as they were torturing people. So I began to recognize that these people acted with a kind of quasi-autonomy that allowed the state a certain cover, a certain level of structural deniability and auto-immunization. So that's how this, what I call this in my book, the containerization of the state of war. Containerization of war. Now, when corporations containerize themselves, they become transnational corporations. They set up their operations, they offshore themselves, they leave the United States and go to Southeast Asia, they go to Africa to do things like manufacturing cigarettes without any health warnings, right? Or to manufacture and sell to those local populations pharmaceuticals that were banned in the United States because they had too many side effects. This is called containerization, right? You increase your predatory power while escaping accountability at the same time. So the transnational corporation containerizes itself in offshore transnational locations and is no longer held accountable to the American law. We see this in drone weaponry, which has these elongated kill chains where the deaths occur thousands of miles away from the perpetrator, right? We see this in the outsourcing, military outsourcing, right? privatized contractors perform this type of violence on the part of the United States. And we see this in extraordinary renditions to black sites. War itself has now been subjected to an extraordinary rendition to the black sites of deniability, disavowal, self-retraction, and invisibility. So, it's a long answer to interesting. Very good question. Yes?
I was wondering if you could maybe think of examples of counter practices to this delegation of bodies by states.
Speak louder.
If you could think of counter practices of the denegation of bodies by state, because you were talking about the return of the remains here in Spain after the exhumations as privatization. But on the other hand, those practices are very present in the media nowadays, at least.
Yeah.
So maybe we could think of this type of very local practice as at least an intention to go against this control by the state of the bodies and this disappearance of bodies.
Well, yeah, I can think of several things. One of the most obvious example, I'll give you a very obvious example and then less obvious example, but the Plaza de Mayo Madres will refuse any final memorialization of their missing. They want to keep the wound open, right? Because they know that, and I wrote about this in a recent, I gave an interview about this, that immemorialization, memorialization ends up becoming immemorialization, ejecting the disappeared out of time, right? Bodying them in a monument, right, or a museum or an archive, which is simply an inversion of the mass grave in which they were previously incarcerated, right? And what that does, first thing it does, for the people living with disappearance, the singular reality of who that person was. They want to put that missing person back into time. They want to reactivate time for that person. That's why they demonstrate and they advocate, right? They don't want to place them out of time. They don't want to immemorialize them. And the singular details and specificities of where they were when they were abducted, how they were abducted, what type of maltreatment they underwent, how they were executed, if they were executed, and how their bodies were disposed are very specific, are very important to those families. I remember in South Africa, people mourning over the really burnt fragments of a body, as if in that fragment they could recuperate the prior personality of that person before they were disappeared. Now, when you put people into an archive, you create a commensuration. You create value equivalence, akin to commodification, because you commensurate all the singular pain, wounding, and suffering of each individual victim with each other. You make suffering legible and readable. And that betrays the families who disappeared because they lived for decades with the unreadability of that condition. You know? And that's part of their experience and needs to be respected. And so the archive or the museum ends up extracting surplus meaning from the bodies of the disappeared and ends up collectivizing them in a reductive manner. And therefore, in opposing disappearance, it repeats the logic of disappearance, which is arbitrary collectivization of individual people into categories, into typifications. Right? So how does the artifactual collection, the museum, the archive, how do they avoid such typification? How do they avoid such commensuration that reduces and destroys the singularity of each specific victim? So what it means for the families. And of course, the same thing happened to the families. They could become collectivized as survivors of the disappeared. So the Plaza de Mayo Madres resist that by protesting any kind of monument or any type of closure by demonstrating as long as they can. In Guzman's film, one of the women says about the survivors who disappeared, "We are the leprosy of Chilean society. We will not go away. We will eat at the body politic." And recently in Sri Lanka, what mothers of the disappeared did, now some of these mothers are Muslim, some of them are Hindu, and some of them are Buddhist, right? But they went to the temple of the goddess Kali, And my colleague, Enrique de Silva, is working on this, and he performed a cursing ritual against the perpetrators of the disappeared. And this was done in previous times by Tamils against the oppression of the occupied army. So you went to religion, not religion in terms of reconciliation and healing and all that, the kind of Western Abrahamic tradition of religion, but they performed the cursing rituals that people do believe in the efficacy of those rituals in Sri Lankan society. And it was an ecumenical group. They were Buddhists, they were Muslims, and they were Hindus, and they were Christians as well, and they went to this Hindu temple to perform a cursing ritual. So these are forms of resistance. But I was asked to consult on an exhibition on the disappeared that was being funded by Amnesty International in Sri Lanka when I was there about a year ago. And I was horrified. The literature of Amnesty International on the disappeared was a literature of death and mourning. It treated them as already corpses. And I began thinking of the ACTA, which was the gay AIDS protest movement of the early 1990s. And one of the first critiques of ACTA was that the whole discourse around HIV/AIDS in American society was a discourse on death. You get AIDS, you're going to die. And they countered that with the concept of living with AIDS, right? That coexists with AIDS. And I used that principle with this exhibition. I said, we have to get rid of this death imagery and this mourning imagery around the disappeared. We have to talk about them as living, and we have to insert them back into history, back into temporal processes. We have to talk about who they were prior to they were disappeared, and we have to talk about living with disappearance. Because we never stop living with disappearance. I don't care how many bodies, or how many fragments of bodies are returned, how many graves are exhumed. The people who survived, who disappeared, and who were criminalized because they asked questions about their missing, they will live with the disappeared for the rest of their lives. And so it was that beautiful scene in Guzman's film where the daughter of two disappeared, she's a mathematician, and she has a newly born baby, right? And she talks about what it was like to inherit the disappearance of her parents, and she was raised by her grandparents, and how this baby will have to deal with that issue. Or if you're familiar with the film Five Broken Cameras, you know this film of the Palestinian protest, which is a film really about how children witnessed the Israeli occupation and the Israeli repression of nonviolent Palestinian protesters who are trying to oppose and end the Israeli occupation of their land. And it's a film really told from the point of view of the children. And the children, Americans who saw this film were very shocked. So how can they expose their children to this violence? Aren't they supposed to protect them from that? Well, in Palestinian society in the West Bank and Gaza, there is no reserved space where you can hide a child from this violence. They have to inherit this violence. The filmmaker is Five Broken Cameras is about each of the cameras that he used over a period of 5 or 7 years that were destroyed by the Israeli military. And he correlates each of those cameras with each of his children, because each of his 5 children were born into a different political situation. So this is a type of kind of counter-documentary. Guzman, Amat Burnett was the director of Five Broken Cameras, that we have to support, and use as pedagogy, as teaching tools. And we have to really be critical, and we have to confront the NGOs and the legal, the NGOs and the legal theorists dominate the discourse on exhumation, dominate the discourse on transitional justice, and they are culturally insensitive. They don't want to deal with particularities. One of the things I encountered in South Africa, another oppositional model, came from the Isangoma, the traditional healers of South Africa. There was this horrific form of torture that I dealt with. I was listening to testimony about it, called bride torture, where people they were burning, they were forcing their black male prisoners to barbecue meat for their captors, and then after they cooked the meat, they would torture these same people on these barbecue fires, which are called bride, right? And then they later would dispose of the bodies through burning the bodies, right? So we call it bride torture. So these are very horrific, and And one of the problems with the South African Truth Commission that could not deal with the racialized structure of violence. And obviously, this was a violence that was animalizing the black body, treating it as consumption, as food, right? Consuming. And the Truth Commission couldn't really deal with this type of torture. They couldn't make heads or tail of it. And I went to these Gomas, these natural heroes, and they told me, they gave me an explanation which made perfect sense. They said that the soldiers and the policemen who tortured these people over these fires, and then later burnt their bodies after they killed them, became addicted to the smoke of burning human flesh. They understood violence as addiction. They gave me a whole addictive model. Plus they had a spatial model, right? Because of their addiction, they were compelled to go back to the same space over and over again to perform similar acts over and over again. And this is part of kind of South African folk beliefs about bad death. When you die, let's say in a mine cave-in, when you die in a traffic accident, if you don't purify that space, other accidents will reoccur in that space. It's kind of a cyclical history. The notion that this type of, that war produces a kind of a traumatized space, a kind of archipelago of spatial sites which history recycles itself over and over and over again without resolution. And the only way that these soldiers will ever find healing, police will ever find healing, according to the Isangoma, is by purifying themselves, purifying the sites, participating in purification rituals where these bodies were tortured and disposed of, and joining with the families of the victims in these purification rituals. Because in South Africa, they have a very beautiful concept that was part of their pre-Christian, quasi-Christianized religious beliefs, that the dead who were tortured and disappeared, if they can be relocated, their bodies can be reclaimed, if they can go through proper burial, they become ancestor figures for the entire corporate community, for the family and for the community from which they came from. And ancestor figures are kind of moral anchorages for the future, not something part of the past they address. And so these are several counter practices that I've witnessed. But the tendency of these culturally specific practices tend to get erased and dismissed by the universal ethnocentric, cosmopolitanism, Eurocentric discourse of international law, human rights law, and international NGOs, which, the NGOization of death, the NGOization of forensics, right? The NGOization of exhumation, the NGOization of victims of violence, right? I was discussing with Francisco that the psychiatric term they kind of medicalize political disappearance, and whenever they medicalize, they depoliticize, okay? There's another form of making things invisible. The medical or psychiatric term for those who are survivors of disappeared or afflicted with the grief of not knowing where their loved ones are is called ambiguous loss, right? So you have to develop therapy around ambiguous loss. That's a euphemism, right? And you have to be very careful about the euphemism because they depoliticize disappearance. And we have to, there's another concept that comes out of transitional justice, non-reoccurrence. How do we ensure non-reoccurrence? Well, we have to, of these type of practices, whether it was by the Franco regime, or the apartheid regime, or the Allende regime, or the apartheid, in order to do that, or Abu Ghraib, in order to do that, we have to understand what type of power these acts produce for the state. How this, and this really goes back to the work of Elaine Scarry, The Body in Pain, which she like my work, argued that the extraction of information is the secondary or tertiary goal of torture. What torture does is extract power from the body of the victim. It's a production of power for the apparatus of torture. So that's the kind of questions I'm asking about. What does a disappearance of disappearance? What type of power does it produce? And I'm interested in the virtualization of power. And this goes back to the work of Simone Weil, who talked about how the force turns people, not only the dead into things, into stone, the living people, the threat of force turns people into living living things, right? Neither dead nor alive. The virtualization of force, the fear of prospective or threatened force, which turns people into things. And we have to see how this kind of the black holes that are produced by disappearance, what effects it has on the wider society that lives on and lives with the disappeared. And what happens to society that bases itself on the silence around disappearance. And that legacy, you know, if you look at Guzman's work, that legacy is still active today. You never get rid of that silence. And that's why I go back to Francis Barker's statement that mourning together, or mourning, privatized mourning, mourning separately, individually, may be well and fine, but neither gives us access to history. And we need that access to history because history our understanding of history conditions our understanding of the present. I'll give you one last maxim from South Africa. You know, a lot to learn from them. This comes from a transvestite comedian, Peter Dirk van Roy's, and he has a character called Avita van Zuidenhout. And she has does a thing on the South African Truth Commission in the 1990s. And again, he says, the future of South Africa is certain. He was talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this work. However, its past is unpredictable. How do we make the past unpredictable? Thank you.
Thanks, I enjoyed that very much. I have a sort of more not quite a question as a commentary, from a very, very different place. I mean, I like very much your description of the sort of the biopolitical manufacture of an interregnum of sorts, and how that interregnum needs to be populated with new juridical forms and new rights. But I was reminded of sort of, coming from a very different place, I was thinking, what would a comparison, and this is a bit of a flight of fantasy, but what would a comparison with stateless societies? So rather than sort of the manufacture, the way in which the state unfolds itself into this interregnum space and invents or imposes a new juridical apparatus, what would a comparison with stateless societies look like? And I was reminded of the work, for instance, of, I don't know, say, warfare and shamanism in Amazonia, or symbolic economies of predation in Papua New Guinea, where economies of cannibalism, economies of ritual warfare are about stealing people's names or killing people in order to be able to dream their dreams, and the sort of male initiation rituals because this is mostly a symbolic, ritual, symbolic acts of warfare. They're really male initiation rituals. So I was thinking, well, it'd be interesting to draw an analogy here between the rites of passage, and drawing from Van Gennep and liminality, and the those blurring states, the rites of passage in stateless society, and the rights, as in juridical rights, and as in the legal right, and the rites of passage that the state needs to invent for itself in this interregnum societies, and whether there might be any purchase in drawing those two analogies.
Well, the analogy was drawn by British colonialism, which basically, when they colonized Africa and India, particularly West African societies, which were prior to colonization stateless societies or acephalous societies, they began to imported bureaucrats, but also anthropologists who focused on the extended kinship structures of the societies and began to reconvert them into juridical structures, right? So law became the predominant interpretive paradigm of African societies, and basically it was part of the process of colonial indirect rule, having to invent chieftains. And even the concept of the tribe is a colonial concept. And actually, I would argue that the concept of stateless society is a colonial concept because you cannot talk about stateless society without reference to the state. So it's theorized from the point of view of the state, not from the point of view of the so-called stateless society. And then again, in our contemporary period, how many stateless societies are left? Now we deal with the issue of failed states, right? Because we have these post-colonial apparatuses that inherited colonial structures that have become utterly unworkable, that created these kind of nation-state boundaries, you know, and forced fit different ethnic armed with African, British-trained African models, and began to see that that within that society there was no stable kinship structure. That kinship relations were symbolic. They were based on exchange, performativity. We're back to that again. Based on experiences of commensality and shared substance, and that they change from situation to situation and from context to context. So there was no. So you could not compare those structures to stable juridical institutions. And war was symbolic war. You maybe hurt a couple of people, maybe you kill one person, and then you stop, and you go back home, right? The genocide was unthinkable in that type of society. So, I mean, in my own work, I'm always asked one question. How do you define violence? And I have no universal definition of violence. So I think that's where your question is coming from. That you're saddled with a universalized definition of violence when you see other forms of violence. So we have to reduce it to what we already know. But, you know, there is no pristine stateless society anymore. In fact, you know, the so-called global South has been colonized with Western forms of bureaucracy and bureaucratization. And in many ways, it's like the work of the Komarovs, who've said with, you know, the kind of collapse of neoliberal economic structures, with the kind of self-attrition or eternal polemos of the state is at war with itself, that Europe and North America first will have to begin learning from the global South, because these things that we're going through now, they were the first victims of the first experience of that. And then again, I think of my teacher, Stanley Diamond, who was focused very much on stateless society because he wanted to be able to critique state formation through this model. He argued that anthropology historically has been the study of people in crisis by people in crisis. There is no stable anthropological object anymore. So I'm a great advocate for situated, site-specific political contingency. And we have to, and I follow the work of someone like Althusser on aleatory work. What I'm doing here in this project, when I talk about Gulbuddin and that type of extrajudicial killing, I'm not talking about, see, in English we have only one word for power, right? But in the Latin languages, I'm not sure in Spanish, but there are at least two. In Latin, there's potestas and potentia. Potestas means already constituted power, right? That's the juridical power that you're referring to. Potentia is power in the making. And what I wanted to argue in this process, this event that I described, Gulbuddin's killing, is the departure of the American army from potestas, already constituted power, which would be structurally connected to jus ad bellum, justified war, and its entry into potentia, power in the making of new power. This is what Walter Benjamin, following Carl Schmitt, distinguished between law-conserving violence, right? Justified war is a form of law-conserving violence, and what Benjamin talked about, law-founding violence, right? A violence that founds its own law. Benjamin was arguing that, you know, the kind of appurate, apparatic structure that, let's say you take the French Revolution, take the American Revolution, we the people. When the Americans said we the people, they had no right to say that. They had no juridical ground in which they could identify and declare themselves we the people in the Declaration of Independence. There was no law that authorized that. That was a law-founding violence. They founded the law, and in retrospect, legalized that statement. See? There's a kind of, you know, there's a future interior, right? I'll just process. So I think that's what we have to begin to look at how war is making itself and making its own grounds of legitimation. It becomes autopoetic, autoconstructive, and then it is mediating between the visible and the invisible to create the kind of facticity of war. I distinguish in my work between the factuality of war and the surplus, excessive actuality of war. War as a truth-making regime, and what is excluded from the truth that war causes.
Thank you very much. We are going to have lunch right now, so if you want to join us, we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much, Professor.